Faculty at IISER Pune. My primary focus of research is sound, and I study how sound works in the natural environment. But more importantly, we try and use this sound to understand ecological patterns and how we can, what sort of patterns and processes operate in the wild. And for this, we primarily use birds and bats as our study systems here at IISER. And the talk I'm going to give to you today is going to touch upon some of those things, but is more of a broad philosophical talk, really. I'm going to talk to you about the importance of having sort of a common sense understanding of physics and how it is very important for biologists, particularly in the field, to have that common sense understanding of physics. And with that, it can tell you a whole new set of things about the natural world and give you a whole new appreciation for everything that you see in the world around you. And I'm also going to talk about how that is important, not just when we're thinking about conserving nature, but also in terms of what can we learn from nature as well. And so that's why sort of the vice versa aspects of my talk. So if we apply physics, we can understand nature better, but I'm also going to discuss a few examples of where we have learned something by studying animals in the wild. And I'm going to sort of cover a broad swathe of animals as much as possible, but excuse me, but I'm going to sort of stick around these things, mostly focus on three broad areas where I feel we've had the most contributions from studying animals in the field and studying their form. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about form and function and about how animals are built, just as an introduction, really. And then I'm going to talk about two aspects of my own research. So I also do a little bit of work on color. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the physics of animal color and what sorts of things you can do with it if you have the perspective and the tools that engineers have developed over the years to study color. And then I'll go into and talk about sound. And I'll sort of intersperse this with vignettes from my own work, so you can see sort of how this is applied and where we can go with this. And by and large, I tend to use my presentations as visual aids. So there's not going to be a lot of material on them, just a lot of pictures and very little text. But I'm going to sort of talk you through what's going on with those pictures and hopefully try and tell a story if I'm successful at this. And if there are any questions, please do leave them in the form provided and I'll get to them at the end. All right, so I'm going to share my presentation now so that we can start this off. And here we go. So as mentioned and as advertised, my talk is titled What Physics Tells Us About the Natural World and Vice Versa. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the diversity of the natural world and what intrigues me about it when I look at animals around, in the wild. So to start off with, the first thing that motivates me and many other people trying to understand how animals work is that the world of animals is and was, I'm going to get to that in a minute, really diverse. All right, just as an example, here are a series of photos, most of which I've taken myself in travels around the world. I've been lucky enough to travel and see a lot of animals. And when you look at the animals around you, here are sorts of the ideas that you think about. So this bird sitting on a branch here is a white-browed fantail. And as you can see, it is a fairly typical bird. But with that means it has perching claws with which it grasps a branch. These claws are capable of grasping branches in that way and supporting the bird's weight on it so that it doesn't tip over or fall off. It's sitting in such a posture such that its front end, which is heavier, is upright so that the bird doesn't tip forward as it falls off the branch. It's got wings, which allow it to fly, but it's also got this long tail, which they spread when they fly, sort of giving them a very floaty appearance when they fly. All of these are phenomena of physics in the natural world, and each of those is a fascinating question to study. But the diversity is seemingly endless. Take an example of this grizzly bear, for instance. It is a rather large animal, and it has rather large limbs to support its weight. But when it walks, as you can see, it can flex its joints in this manner as it walks. And that same joint can be used to snatch salmon out of a river with this sort of wrist movement that it has here. On the contrary, another fairly large animal, these are caribou or reindeer, and apologies that they're shot from behind, but the idea was to show you their legs and feet. They have long legs, which suggests long and slender legs, which suggest what you'd call a cursorial lifestyle. They're able to run really fast. And that, obviously, anyone who's familiar with the Christmas fables of Santa Claus will No, reindeer can run pretty fast. But the front legs and the hind legs are quite different from each other because their role when the animal moves are quite different. Mammals and birds and others have taken not just to the air or the land, but to water as well. And when whales, so this is a humpback whale swimming, and when humpback whales took to the water, they lost the need to support their weight in the way that the bear does. The bear's strong legs help it support its weight so that it can move around. The humpback whale doesn't need that support anymore because it was in the water, and the buoyancy of the water took care of its weight for it. So they've reduced their limbs to flippers and rather streamlined their body to swim. And you're going to see a little more of that in a few slides since. The sea otter is also taken to water, but relatively more recently than the whales, and it still has legs and can still move about on land, but is obviously still aquatic and has adapted to an entirely fish diet in this case. Well, fish and mollusks, that's what they eat. But as an aquatic mammal, even aquatic mammals show a great deal of diversity. And of course, one group of mammals, one of which we study here at IISER, bats, have taken to the skies, just like birds have, but they're very, very different from birds. The wing of a bat, you can immediately see, is very different. It's supported by finger bones so that the wing looks membranous. And obviously, anyone who knows the Batman logo knows that a bat wing is very different from a bird wing, right? And bats are obviously still mammals. They're furry. They have other characteristics of mammals, and they hang upside down, which birds don't do. So because of the way bats have evolved and the way their wings have evolved, instead of perching like this on branches, they hang upside down in caves. And this is a mouse-tailed bat hanging upside down in a cave. And what bats are able, the other adaptations that bats are able to exhibit to their environment are really fascinating and have really informed a lot of our technology so far. So I'm going to talk a bit more about bats as the talk progresses. Again, just to show you some more diversity, birds have taken to the water too. This murrelet is swimming on water. And in order to swim on water without getting waterlogged and drowning, it needs to repel water from its feathers. So it coats its feathers with a hydrophobic substance such that its feathers don't wet. And therefore, it's able to swim without getting waterlogged. Reptiles, such as these two lizards here, so this is a spiny-tailed lizard that is adapted to arid environments because essentially it has adaptations and dietary specializations that minimize water loss. So it can live in fairly arid environments without desiccating. And that's another case of where understanding what I call common sense physics helps you understand really where these animals evolved from, how they're specialized to their environments, and how they're able to survive in some of these extreme conditions. This is an agama that's crawling out from under a rock. You can see here it's got slightly expanded ribs, so that allows it to flatten itself out and go into crevices where nothing else can go. And animals such as these that are able to do that have inspired us to design robots that are able to do the same thing and to get into places where no human being can reach. All right? Again, birds live on the ground as well, just like mammals do. These are sand grouse that spend most of their time on the ground, but of course, they can fly too. Seals, again, are another of my favorite. They're another aquatic animal that shows just how, a mammal rather, that shows just how diverse these are. They also have flippers. They're very graceful in the water. They can swim at great speeds, but when they haul out onto land, they can't really move a lot. So they just sort of roll around on beds of ice like these harbor seals are doing. And of course, that's not even to begin to touch the diversity of insects, which are the most speciose and diverse group in the world. And there are literally millions of insects on this planet, and they exhibit all sorts of fascinating adaptations. They have their mouth parts, for instance, can function as straws to suck nectar out of a flower using capillary forces. They can function as files and scrapers to pierce blood vessels or pierce fruit. And they can also function as really fine grazing or cutting implements to cut out plants and eat plant material as well. So that if one were just to study any one of these groups, one would have a lifetime's worth of work ahead of them. And there is just so much diversity on this planet. And we've not even scratched the surface of what was. All right? Animals have been on this earth for millions and millions of years. And they've really gone through a lot of changes in that span of time. There are a lot of forms back then that don't exist now. Okay, here, for example, this is from the American Museum of Natural History on a visit that I went to in 2015, I believe. So this skeleton here is that of a woolly mammoth, Mammuthus. This is a dinosaur that lived much, much before it, Triceratops. Similarly, large animals, obviously very different from each other, but look at the huge feet that supported this massive weight and size that they had. Here are some humans for scale next to a mammoth. Okay, this is an old amphibian called Eryops, which also had thick limbs to support its weight, but sort of splayed out to the side, which suggests that it was squat and somewhat low slung to the ground, but was able to carry its own weight. And I teach a course about these at IISER, and Eryops is one of my favorite animals to talk about just because it was one of the earliest animals on land back in the Carboniferous and the Permian several 100 million years ago. Fish are obviously familiar to all of us today, but this in particular is a nearly 20-foot-long giant predatory fish that lived in the Cretaceous. It shared the seas at the same time as the dinosaurs lived on land. And this fish, it's called Cephactinus, if anyone is interested. This fish exhibits all the skeletal adaptations that modern-day fish do. It has this sort of spindle shape that allows it to cut through the water without experiencing friction or drag. All right. It has this powerful tail at the end that propelled it through the water, probably by side-to-side undulations. And it also has a mouthful of teeth, and apparently was such a voracious predator that there is a fossil of one that apparently died swallowing a fish that was too big for it. So there is half a fish stuck in its gullet, and it actually, the fish actually died swallowing it. And this is one of the more famous fossils that exist. If any of you are interested, it's called fish within a fish. Very, very descriptively. So what paleontologists do now is try to take what we've learned about extant or living animals and try to understand how extinct animals like dinosaurs and mammoths and Eryops were built and how they might have functioned. And that helps us understand how present diversity actually evolved. All right. And that's because diversity of form generally correlates to diversity of function, because simple mechanics says that if you are shaped differently, you will function differently, right? If you are round, you roll. If you're a square, it's much harder for you to roll. And it's really that simple. Just animals that live in the water have a lot of diversity of form, and this correlates to diversity of function as well. Let's look at a flying fish, for example, with these huge broad fins that it can flare. And when it flares these fins and it jumps out of the water, it is able to skate along for a considerable distance through the air and out of water, and that helps it get away from predators. We tend to think of whales and dolphins as sort of a singular group of animals. But within that, you've got the huge sperm whale with its barrel-shaped head, which can dive to great depths on account of both its size and its power. And you've got dolphins. These are, I believe, white-sided dolphins that are more sleek and swim at much greater speeds generally. And they exhibit this behavior called porpoising, where speed reaches a point where they can break clear of the waves and sort of jump along with them. And they often do this when riding alongside boats. That is something that the size of a sperm whale will not permit it to do, just because of its own weight. All right. And within these simple statements, there's a lot of basic physics, sort of underlying all of these simple statements. And that's something that interests me as a scientist as well, and as a teacher, because what we try to communicate is that understanding these principles will help you understand a lot more about how animals behave and how they move. And that in turn has a lot of importance for how we can actually try to conserve them and their habitats as well. And that doesn't necessarily require you to know a lot of math. I myself don't know a lot of math, but you know enough to see that when you look at a penguin, you know that the penguin's wings are obviously not functional in flight. They're far too small relative to its body size to provide it enough lift to get off the ground. But when in the water, their shape provides great propulsion for a penguin to sort of row itself through the water, making the same motions as a flying bird does. All right. And this is a koipu. It's sort of an aquatic rodent, which is swimming at the surface of the water. Again, has a whole different approach to how it swims and gets around. It generally keeps its head above water because it can't hold its breath for as long as, say, a penguin can. And it lives in much shallower water, obviously. because if it lived in water this deep, it would probably not be able to get around very easily. All of these are often extrapolations you can make just by looking at how animals are built. And when you want to understand how an animal is built, you have to go back and look at anatomy in detail. And that's where museums such as the American Museum and many others come in handy. Because in addition to being able to study animals in the field, it's important to be able to go back and examine anatomy in detail, sometimes in a way that's not always easy to do in the field. So what we have, fortunately, at our disposal is that a lot of early biology, back when you couldn't have photographs or video, was done by collecting specimens. And these specimens still remain in many museums across the world, including in India. And what they do, skeletal specimens, they can tell us a lot about how an animal is built. For example, if we consider just appendages, most appendages function in two particular ways. The first is as a lever. So when I move my arm, if you can see this, my arm functions using lever action. And this lever action allows me to exert force to lift things with my own arm. And the length of that lever arm tells you a lot about the kind of forces that an animal can exert. So this is the skeleton of a mole. And if you look at its front claws, they have very short lever arms, very short limbs with broad hands, okay, broad digits and palms. And that paddle-like shape suggests that this limb gives you a lot of power. So it's a very strong, robust limb. And the paddle-like shape is what gives the mole its ability to dig through soil at great speed and make molehills, which, of course, give rise to the phrase to make a mountain out of a molehill, because if a mole keeps digging, it shall eventually make one. And if you look at another rodent, the jerboa, this is the skeleton of a jerboa, you'll see the jerboa's front limbs are obviously really tiny. So it's clearly not digging anything with those limbs. Its hind limbs, on the other hand, are enormously elongated. All right. And this elongated hind limb suggests that they have great propulsive power and probably great speed as well. They are able to move at great speed because of these enormously lengthened hind limbs. And jerboa, in fact, can actually clear the ground and hop around like kangaroos. All right. The same principle applies for birds as well, right? The forelimbs of birds are heavily modified. You don't really have the kind of digits that we're familiar with, but they're modified into these structures that support feathers and that form wings. And they possess these giant breastbones with this carina, these keels that basically increase the surface area for muscles to attach. And when you increase the surface area for muscles to attach, you allow for great propulsive power for these wings. But if a bird were to lose the ability to fly, say it became really big, you can often just tell by looking at the skeleton. So this is a skeleton of Aepyornis, the elephant bird of Madagascar, which is now extinct. And you can see that the breastbone is much reduced. And of course, there's hardly any sign of those forelimbs at all. So it had pretty much non-existent wings and non-existent attachment points for flight muscles. It expended its energy elsewhere, essentially, in getting really big. So when it got really big and its hind limbs got really strong and powerful, it would walk on the ground at almost 10 feet height and had no need of getting off the ground. So it had no need of these muscles and this breastbone, evolutionarily speaking, and therefore it lost them. As I mentioned earlier, thick legs allow you to support your own weight. So this is a skeleton of an Apatosaurus at the American Museum, again, with people next to it for scale. I always like these pictures because they give you an idea of just how big dinosaurs actually were. And these pillar-like feet served essentially to transfer their own weight. So they transferred all their weight onto these pillars, which were robust enough to be able to take them without fracturing. All right. And their tails and their necks, which were enormously elongated, served like the bridge aspects of a suspension bridge, so that they balanced essentially on these pivot points, their legs. So by balancing on their legs, they likely were able to essentially stop themselves from tipping over. And we're still trying to understand more and more about this. So our estimates of how sauropods balanced and moved are being improved as new information comes to light. And by studying extant animals like giraffes and others, which are our closest reference point to what sauropod dinosaurs might have actually done. And finally, this is one of my favorite This is an ancient placoderm fish from the Devonian period. It's called Dunkleosteus, which had no teeth, but it had these armored plates that basically narrowed down to a knife edge. And they are a great example of where if you exert pressure through a narrowed knife edge, you can tremendously increase your bite force. So they had a slicing, shearing bite because this tooth narrowed down to a knife edge and could exert a great force. And that force that they exerted was one of the largest known of any fish. And that's because we have an estimate of what the bite force capability actually was. And we have that because of museums and fossil material. All right. So broadly, these fields that I've discussed earlier come under what's called biomechanics. And biomechanics seeks to understand the relationship between animals and their physical environment. All right. So fluid biomechanics, for instance, talks a lot about how animals move through fluids, whether it be air or water. Okay. And there is also an entire field of solid biomechanics, which talks about structures like these bones and how these bones are, the material of these bones enables them to support enormous weights without fracturing under the loads. All right. And these two fields in particular, I am closest to fluid mechanics because I was exposed to it a lot during my graduate school days, which was at the NCBS in Bangalore studying moths. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about moths in a minute. But the idea of how animals fly has been something that has inspired technology for a long time. It's one of our best examples of what we've learned from animals. Going way back to more than a century ago, the invention of gliders was inspired by gliding birds. And this is a case of someone testing out one of the first gliders ever built and trying to soar using the same sort of structure and structural patterns that birds used when they fly. And more recently, the Shinkansen train in Japan was sort of inspired by the streamlining of a kingfisher to cut drag, which enabled it to move a lot faster than it otherwise would be able to do. And nowadays, a lot of research focuses on hovering animals. And hovering is another of those cases where very divergent animals, hummingbirds and hawkmoths, in fact, this hawkmoth is called the hummingbird hawkmoth, have evolved the ability to hover, where they can sort of move their wings in this manner and stay absolutely stationary to collect nectar from a flower. And they both accomplish this in similar yet somewhat different ways. And by studying them, people hope to be able to design drones or miniature robots or flappers that can do the same thing and allow us to expand how technologically we can actually move around in the air. And this has also, of course, made its way into pop culture. My favorite example being the cartoon Legend of Korra, for those of you who actually watch it. And if there are any of you out there who are fans of it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. In these cases, this ability to hover gives hummingbirds and hawkmoths the ability to sort of move back and forth, which is especially important if a flower is moving in the wind, say, when you're trying to feed from it. And that's something that people study by actually putting these animals in wind tunnels and measuring the flow patterns of air around their wings as they fly. And this allows them to learn more that actually inspires our own technology. And if there was ever an argument for why it is important to preserve nature, it is what we can learn from it, what we can actually take from it to actually make our own lives more sustainable and also more convenient. Okay, so that's often the argument I like to make about one of the reasons it is important to conserve nature. But there are many other aspects and many other interesting things that animals can teach us. So if I'm going to move on to the next part of the talk I was going to give, I'm going to talk a little bit about color. All right, animals are colorful. You can see that from these pictures here. These birds are barbets, which is a group of birds that I work on quite a bit. And a lot of these colors come from many different sources. So these reds and yellows here, etc., are pigment colors. And in particular, they're called carotenoid pigments because they come in from the diet. So birds eat these, and then they have processes that change these pigments and then deposit them in their feathers. So there is a process of diffusion of these pigments into the feathers that gives them their color. And this color depends on what the animals are eating. All right. So if you change the diet of, say, one of these birds, the color will change accordingly. And that's really interesting there, because the reason these pigments give these colors is because they absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect or emit others. All right. If they actually emitted light, it's fluorescent or luminescent. In this case, they are colors that reflect, they're pigments that reflect red light, and therefore you get a lot of red. But in the case of most animals, and this includes birds like these barbets and also these insects, blues and shorter wavelength colors, blue, violet, etc., are not pigments. They arise because there are small uh, light scattering structures in feathers or in the scales of butterfly wings or in the cuticle of this beetle's elytra. The elytra is what you call that modified pair of wings that covers the other wings in beetles. And these microscopic structures within butterfly scales or bird feathers scatter light such that they appear blue or green. And that's what you call biophotonic structures or structural colors in this case. How might we actually be able to study these colors and quantify them? Well, that's something that I do with my work. So one of the easiest ways to do that, and this is why another reason why specimens such as these that are collected from across Asia, from Sri Lanka to Java to Sumatra to Northeast India, way back, are so important because they allow you to measure color in a quantitative way. And one way to do that is to take museum specimens. So when I did this study, which was recently published, if any of you are interested in reading it, we actually took a selection of specimens from 4 different bird groups, and we actually measured these colors using something called a reflectance spectrometer. So what a reflectance spectrometer does is it has a little fiber optic probe, and if you hold it over these colors, it shines a UV visible light through an arc lamp. So it goes through an arc lamp on the fiber optic down onto the specimen, and then it measures the wavelength content of the reflected light. So this, for instance, is a blue-headed pitta, which you can see reflects mainly at low wavelengths. So it's a intense blue-violet color. And the same goes for the plum-headed parakeet, except it's slightly darker. Okay, that's not terribly surprising. If you look at the violet of the back head of a plum-headed parakeet here versus the head of a blue-headed pitta, the blue-headed pitta is much more intense. Okay, I hope you can see my laser pointer here. But if not, the plum-headed parakeet is in C 4th from the top, and the blue-headed pitta is in A 3rd from the top. All right, so you get these spectra, and then you can do something really cool with them. You can actually theoretically estimate where they are in what's called a color space. So you can actually measure colors with respect to each other. Now, birds have 4 different color receptors in their eyes. Okay, now so think of each of these as a sensor with a different sensitivity. All right, to those of you out there who have training in engineering or who are engineering students, you have these 4 sensors with different sensitivity functions. You can actually put the spectrum through this and say, how much will the spectrum trigger each of the 4 sensors? And you can map that onto a tetrahedral space. So this little tetrahedron, if you map it on there, it's going to tell you where each color lies. Okay. Now I know this might be a little complicated for someone who's not from a physics or an engineering background, but basically all this is going to tell you is how red or how blue or how green or how UV a color is. So the more you essentially take this complex color and condense it into one point in space, and that allows you to compare all of these color spectra using these models. So that was something we were able to do, and through that we were actually able to find the diversity of color patterns in many of these bird groups. So some birds lay along this area because their colors sort of evolved and diverged along an axis here. Others evolved and diverged along an axis here between red and violet. So if you, for instance, look at these pittas, there's a lot of bright red and bright blue that sort of got shuffled around. And that's how you got these very diverse patterns, even though the underlying colors themselves are fairly similar to each other. They've gotten great diversity just by where they've placed them. Okay, so that's really interesting. And if we want to go further and look into the mechanisms of these colors, particularly structural colors, because they're some of the most interesting of all, we can sort of see how they might arise. So structural colors generally arise because if you have 2 different layers or a boundary between 2 materials, they reflect light differently, and at different, because they reflect at different angles, the 2 rays of light will be out of phase with each other and will interfere. And the interference patterns produce very intense colors. Okay, so if you look in the scale of a butterfly wing, what are these structures really? If you look at the scales of a butterfly wing and you look at them closer and closer, you see these regular ordered lines And within there, there's even more ordered structures that form little miniature diffraction gratings. And these miniature diffraction gratings are what scatters the colors to produce these sort of intense blues and violets in the eye spots of butterflies. And we found similar diffraction gratings in the feathers of birds, in other such um, in other taxa as well. Even in the skin of reptiles and amphibians, there are collagen rods that function as diffraction gratings to produce these intense structural colors. And what can we learn from them? So by applying basic principles of physics, we've understood something about how animals are so colorful. What can we take back from there? What we can take back from there is actually designing fabrics that same way. So there is a lot of work going on to design fabrics that adjust to their environment for camouflage purposes. So say if you were someone who wanted to film wildlife in their natural environment, you could have a self-camouflaging outfit that blends in with whatever background, just in theory. This is just an idea I'm throwing out there. A lot of these applications are, of course, military in orientation right now. But there is a lot we too can take back from understanding how animals are able to produce these colors. Some animals are able to switch on and off these colors depending on the orientation of the grating. And that's also something that we can take away from studying structural colors. But my main research focus is sound, all right? And for the last 10 to 15 minutes that I have here, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about animal acoustics. Because the animals, in particular birds and bats, which I study a lot, produce a lot of sound. This streaked laughing thrush, for instance, is sitting on a rock and singing a territorial song. And sometimes animals, birds in particular, use whatever they can find. This black francolin here found a little man-made stone marker and is sitting on top of it and belting out its song. And you're going to see what that song is in just a minute. So here's a video that a friend of mine took when we visited this place together last year. Okay, so this bird essentially uses its vocal cords to produce a loud sound, the loud, harsh, cackling sound that can carry for great distance. And the sounds of birds are extremely diverse. Not all of them are even produced by the vocal cords. In fact, in this video, just pay attention to the little black dot here, where my laser pointer is, if you can see it, right in the center at the bottom. And you're going to see something in a few seconds. Okay. That is a very endangered bird called a lesser florican displaying. All right. And when it displays, it jumps out of the grass and produces, I don't know if you heard it, that little rattling noise. If you didn't hear it, you're going to hear it again in the next slide, so worry not. That rattling noise is produced by its wings. So it is what is called a sonation, something akin to snapping your fingers, except with feathers. And it is not a vocal sound. It is non-vocal. It is produced by feather structures. And you can take all of these sounds and try to visualize them to understand how they differ from each other. And one of the easiest tools to do that is a spectrogram. So what a spectrogram is taking something called a Fourier transform. Again, people from engineering or physics backgrounds will know what a Fourier transform is. So what a Fourier transform eventually gives you is this spectrogram, which is a series of time versus frequency or pitch. Okay, so if I speak like this, I will be lower down in the frequency range. And if I speak like this, I will be higher up in the frequency range. So that's the easiest way to understand it. And the darker a sound is here, the louder it is. All right, you can visualize them in many different ways. There are a lot of people who use black and white. A lot of people use color. Personally, I prefer color, but whatever floats your boat really. And so I just put these here to show you the contrasts and how people can actually visualize spectrograms. So you'll see a lot of them, but they mean the same thing. Darker or brighter in this case means a louder sound. So let's listen to the two sounds we heard again. So first we'll hear that lesser florican again. Okay, so that's that rattling sonation. And you can see that it forms these little click noises on a spectrogram. Whereas the harsh cackling of a black francolin sounds something like this. And you can actually see these sounds in time and visualize them and compare them to each other. You can measure the frequencies of sound. You can, in the field, you can compare them to each other, and you can understand a lot about bird behavior from it. If, for example, this diversity of sounds and sound production enables birds to be able to effectively communicate, and many birds and other animals, over much larger distances relative to their size than our own technology can do. Okay, this rain quail is rearing up on its hind legs and throwing its head back to emit a call that, even though the bird is about this big, can be heard for a couple of 100 meters. Okay, so for its size, it produces a very loud sound. This is a bird called a sage grouse from the US that has these big sacs that it inflates and makes this booming sound. And the pouch actually serves as a resonator. So it takes these sound vibrations, amplifies them by resonance, and booms them out, because the actual membrane that produces these sounds is really small. So by resonance, birds are able to produce sounds that are much louder than their size will permit. And they actually far outstrip our most effective communication tools, especially at the frequencies that birds can produce sounds at. And they're not the only organisms that produce sounds. Crickets, like in this case, this particular cricket uses its tegmina, these little modified wings, to produce sound by rubbing a leg or foreleg against them to produce sound. Dolphins produce sounds through their blowholes, because you can't obviously open your mouth when you're underwater. So there's this structure called a phonic lip inside the blowhole that vibrates. And then the sounds go into this little fluid-filled structure that's called a melon, because it's shaped like a melon. And this melon actually serves to amplify, couple, and focus the sound and radiate it outwards from the head. So it's actually a radiator and a coupling device. Okay, for those familiar with acoustic technology, it's a coupling device and a radiator that serves to propel sounds outwards. And in the waters where dolphins live, these intense clicks can travel for great distances. And they're really useful because they enable dolphins to do something a lot more with sound than just communicate. And I'm going to get to that in a second, right? So by measuring these frequencies of these diverse signals, you can understand how groups of related birds, okay, these are prenias together. This is a study that we did in my lab a couple of years ago and just published this year. And this was something that an undergraduate of mine did, trying to understand if you can measure the properties of these different sounds and collapse them into a point in space, just like you did with the color. You can actually try to understand how these birds sing in relation to each other and how their signals are potentially separable from each other. So if you actually make this space for these 4 species that live together in the same area, this is in Pune city, you can see that their signals don't overlap with each other at all. And you can actually verify this using machine learning. You can actually use a classifier built using machine learning to separate these songs from each other. And what you get is an over 90% accuracy, which says that their songs are, so here you've got the true songs, and here you've got what the algorithm predicted them as. And in more than 90% of the cases, it was actually correct, which says that these songs sort of divide up the acoustic spectrum in ways such that they can communicate over each other without being heard. Much the same way that our own broadcasting devices divide up the acoustic spectrum so that they don't interfere with each other. So there's a lot of parallels between what our technology does and what birds out in the wild do. But perhaps the most famous of such parallels involving sound is sonar. And sonar most famously is employed by bats, which echolocate. So this is a video that my colleague Rohit took in Thailand and shows bats swarming en masse out of a cave in the evening, because bats are obviously nocturnal. So they fly out of caves in the evening to forage. And when they forage, they are foraging often in complete darkness. And this is where they evolved sonar. Okay, sonar means they emit loud vocalizations that allow them to navigate and locate food, often in pitch darkness. They are not the only animals that do it. Dolphins do it. These birds, these are called oil birds from South America. I believe these are photographed in Trinidad. They are also birds that emit clicks that allow them to echolocate. But bats are perhaps the most famous of all. And the way that animals perform these tasks has inspired our own technology, because we've built tools that do the same thing as bats and dolphins do. We use sound to find where the ocean floor is, to navigate through obstacles, and we're always trying to improve our own sonar. But the animal kingdom has far outstripped our own in many ways. Okay, so how do bats echolocate? Well, they produce these calls, and there are 2 major types of calls. But bats produce extremely loud calls that are ultrasonic. They're so high-pitched we can't hear them. The sounds travel outwards and bounce back from returning objects, from objects in the environment. And bats use the time between emission and arrival to determine what the distance is. Okay, speed is distance over time. That in itself will give you where the distance is, and bats can work that out and steer accordingly. They can also steer towards an insect and detect small objects and steer towards that and catch them using only their sonar. And there are two kinds of major calls that bats emit. There are these what you call FM or frequency modulated calls, which look like little downward sweeps or chirps. And there's this other called a CF call, which goes like a beep. It's this constant frequency beep. Okay. And these calls in particular are useful because they allow bats to determine what the velocity of a target insect is. And when the bats actually start to approach their target insect, they start to ping them faster and faster to improve their resolution and steering in fine control towards catching that insect. You can hear that for both an FM bat, you're going to hear it for a pipistrelle, and then you're going to hear it for one of those CF bats, which is a horseshoe bat. All right. And you're going to hear in both cases the calls slowed down about 20 times so that we can hear them. So they bring them into our own hearing range. So first, let's listen to the pipistrelle. Those chirps of the bat. Speeds up. And that little buzz at the end is what's called the feeding buzz. And just listening to this, you know that the bat is about to attack an insect, okay, because it has gone into the final phase where it's really close to an insect. CF bats do this too, but it sounds somewhat different because the call isn't a chirp. That whine, speeding up. So it speeds up as well. And bats' calls sound like these long nasal whines, which are very narrow in the frequency spectrum because they have these little leaves on their nose. And different species of horseshoe bats have different kinds of leaves which shape the beam of their sound in different ways. So there are a lot of people who've used model bats to study how this leaf shapes the beam of their sound. Right? So animals use sound for many different purposes, for communication, for navigation even, and birds and bats kind of exemplify what all that diversity is. But why is that relevant, and how can this help us in ecology and even conservation? Well, because the sounds they produce are so unique, and because they sort of divide up the acoustic spectrum so neatly, you can actually pull them apart, sometimes even using algorithms, and use them to track the status essentially of a community of birds in this case. And this is something I've done within this sort of park in the city of Pune, where I recorded bird song for hours and hours across different seasons. And I was able to track how often I could detect different bird species. And I found that you could actually track the change in seasons. So these red species are breeding birds that moved out of the area or went quiet in the winter. And these blue lines represent birds that came into the community in the winter. So there's a lot of change in birdsong over the winter, and this allows us to Hello. No. The connection went. No. Okay. Can you tell me where I was when you lost me? After the video, Can you tell me? This one? This one? Okay, I'll start from here again. Okay. So I'm really sorry about that, the technical malfunction. I don't know where I cut off, so I'm going to start again at this slide. So I'm going to say that animals produce sound. What I was saying when I cut off was that animals produce sound for diverse purposes. They produce sound to communicate clearly and also to navigate, just as bats do. So how is this relevant to us when we are trying to think about conservation and ecology and going out into the field and trying to understand wildlife? How can understanding physics help us actually preserve the natural world in addition to understanding it and learning from it? Uh, so I think the best illustration of that is something that we ourselves do, which is to actually put out microphones and recorders and record sound and use it to understand patterns in ecological communities. So this is what I did in the city of Pune, sort of put out microphones and recorded hours and hours of birdsong across seasons. And what I did was I could measure how likely I was to be able to detect a species with these microphones and track changes in bird song over the seasons. And I could do that. You see this red here is species that were active in the monsoon but had gone quiet by winter. And the blue here is species that were the other way around, that became and moved into the community in the winter. So there's a lot of community change, and tracking that community change helps us understand when migrations arrive and how they change in response to human activities, how urbanization affects the bird community, and how generally changes in the landscape influence birds. And that in turn is our early warning system, because they are in turn a warning of the effects of urbanization and how we're actually losing wildlife. All right. And if you take all of these signals, you consider them together in a space, they're what's called the acoustic community. So the acoustic community is a group of animals, not just birds, but other animals, all singing, trying to be heard over the din of each other and the noise of whatever the environment throws at them. And they all sort of divide up the acoustic spectrum in the same way that our own instruments do, or that musical instruments in an orchestra do. And each bird has its place in the community. And if you collapse these signals and measure them into a signal space, which is just like the color space earlier, but in this case, each point represents the sounds of a species, you get this sort of web, this constellation, if you will, and this pattern of species together. And if you compare them across seasons, you can see how the community shifts in these cases. You can measure how sound transmits and propagates. You can estimate, you can use that. And actually, if you have multiple microphones like we do, you can triangulate them and estimate how many of each bird there are. You can actually calculate their populations using nothing but sound. And people do this a lot for bats in particular because their sounds are so loud. You can actually study how noise changes this community using these patterns this way. And you can actually get valuable data that tracks ecological change of entire suites of species. And that's what we like to community acoustics. And that, we think, is a way of using tools designed for acoustics, tools designed by engineers, microphones and recorders that are widely used in the music industry can actually help us study wildlife. And using tools, mathematical tools that engineers have developed, we can actually quantify and help in conservation of entire suites of species, entire suites of birds and bats, in a way that requires nothing other than placing microphones regularly and actually going through these sounds. It's a bit labor intensive right now, but with the use of machine learning, things are slowly getting easier. And there's hope that we'll actually be able to do this in a much more a much more rapid manner in the future. And if you're interested, you can look up some of the work we've done on acoustic communities recently. And that hopefully will give you an idea of how this is just one example. There are so many other ways. If we understand animal locomotion, we can understand where they move in an environment and how far they're likely to move. If we understand bite forces, like those of those giant fish we looked at, we can understand what they're likely to eat and what aspects of the environment we need to focus on when trying to preserve species. So there's a lot of ways in which the ecological and conservation community benefit from what I call a common sense understanding of physics. And I hope I've given you a flavor for that during this talk. And with that, I'll end. I'm sorry for the disconnect that made me go a few minutes over. And I want to thank my lab members, current and former, both who helped with the research and who very kindly allowed me to use some of their photographs and recordings in this talk. Avehi and Priya are my collaborators on the color work. If you're interested at all in how we measure color, do check our paper out. And also many of my other friends who responded to my last-minute requests to use photos. And with that, I will thank you, and I will take any questions that you may have. Do I go to the form now? Okay. Can you still see my video? Okay, excellent. I will just go there now. So we have a question. In music, there is a rest period where there are no bits of music. Is there any study for silence of nature? Well, there are rest periods. So with birds, for instance, they actually sing the most in the morning and the evening. So there are periods where birdsong changes, and birdsong changes through the day as well. So even if you just look at the morning, there are birds. There are some birds sing earlier, some birds sing later. So they separate out in time as well as dividing up the acoustic spectrum. So there is a lot of there are a lot of similarities between birds. I like to talk about orchestral music in particular, but that's why one of my favorite books about birdsong is called Nature's Music. So I think there are a lot of parallels between the two, and of course, there's the idea of a silent, of silent forests, like places where all the birds have been hunted out, etc. So silence is actually something that can help us understand what effects humans may be having on forests that we don't always see. Okay, there's just one response so far. I mean, I responded to one. There's no other response so far. So, okay, maybe if you want to wait another minute, but otherwise, yeah, I think. Sure. Hopefully I didn't bore everyone to death. Okay, so if there's nothing further, then I guess I can head out. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Wait, now there's a whole bunch of questions coming in. Oh, hold on. Now that came in. One from a rather familiar email ID. Actually, well, a lot of familiar email ID. In the study about acoustic communities of Pune birds, did you also look at the effects of urban noise on birds? I did not. I have not yet, because urban noise is something that I believe has to be very carefully measured, because it's not always easy to measure noise. It changes at various points in space. So you have to have a really spatial estimate of noise and how birds respond to it in order to do that. And you also need to calibrate your equipment to what's called the sound pressure level, which at the time I did that study, I didn't have technology, but now I do. So we do actually have the means to do that. But the other important thing to consider is that noise is often at different frequencies from the bird song itself. And that's something that has also received a lot of studies. So there's a lot of literature on urban noise and bird songs. But given the diversity of Indian birds in cities, I suspect there's something very interesting waiting to be done there. It's just something that I believe has to be measured very, very carefully and not haphazardly, which sometimes tends to happen. How have urban sounds affected the natural sound spectrum? There's a lot of talk about that, and that is not something that has a very clear answer, because obviously it causes things to change. It just elevates everything and reduces the signal to noise ratio is most commonly what is thought to happen. There is controversial, I mean, that's not controversial, but there's literature on both sides suggesting that some birds adjust their sounds or their frequencies and change in relation to noise, and in other cases that there isn't any such adjustment. Again, because the frequency of noise is generally lower, it's predicted that lower frequency birds are probably the ones that are most affected by it. But it's not always something that is so cut and dried. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with how complicated it is to actually measure noise. You can't just measure it at one point in space, because birds move and the noise they experience depends on where they are. A bird sitting in a bush full of leaves that damp out noise will have a very different auditory experience from a bird sitting out in traffic. Not that birds regularly sit in traffic, but you know. So that's my, okay, there's more. Can mammals detect and understand mammal sounds and vice versa? Oh, well, I mean, we're mammals and we detect and understand mammal sounds. So I would say the answer is yes. And understand is a very hard thing to quantify. You can't actually, understanding is a very human concept, and you don't actually know what understanding is. You can only measure whether they respond to them. And yes, they frequently do. And birds respond to sounds of other birds, not necessarily even from their own species. Sometimes they respond to the sounds of predators in a certain way. And those responses suggest that they can, in fact, detect sounds. Okay, I guess we're done then. If we're all good, what do I do now? Hello? Yeah, so I guess we're all done. There's no further questions. Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me.